Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming so numerous. I know, thanks for sticking around. It's been like 4 long days of this conference, which I hope was interesting to everybody. Today I wanted to talk about how to reach native-like fluency. It's like everybody's dream to speak like a native speaker or almost like a native speaker. And I thought this was an interesting topic to pick up. I want to thank again Luca. Can you hear me? Hardly? Okay. I'll try to speak a little bit louder. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Is that good? Okay. I just wanted to thank once again Luca because he helped me for the presentations, and also for Tommy McDonald's, who's been so supportive with me during the recent times, which have been a little bit difficult for me. So these are the points I'm going to touch upon. First of all, what does it mean to reach native-like fluency? Then I'm going to talk about the paradox of what I call the paradox of the 4 nights. And then I'm going to illustrate some strategies on how to advance and reach this level. So the very first issue that I wanted to address is, what is native-like fluency, first of all? I'm an engineer. I have a degree in engineering, and I like to define the conditions and a problem before you even try to find a solution. Normally, what happens is that when people say, I have a C2 or I have a C1, a lot of people quibble about the definition of C1, C2, I passed the test, I did this, I did that. But having a C2 doesn't necessarily mean that you have acquired a native level. A native level is something a little bit different from a label. We're talking about a letter and a number here. We can't define the level of a language just with one letter and one number. I think that most of you know CEFR, which is a common frame of reference for non-native speakers. And if you read the brief description here, a person who has reached a C2 can virtually understand everything heard or read with ease, can express himself or herself spontaneously, very fluently, very precisely, differentiating finer shades of meaning in the most complex situations. And as far as use is concerned, can summarize information from different spoken and written sources, reconstructing arguments and accounts coherently. But if you take a look at this is like academic level. But a lot of native speakers never actually reach this level, if you think about it, right? So something is wrong. My point is that having a C2 doesn't mean native or native-like level. Let me explain you why. Now, what happens in our life as native speakers is that we live in a micro and macro environment. Micro environment meaning your family, your friends, girlfriend, boyfriend, close relationships. And then we have the macro environment, which is the society. We go to shops, we interact with people. But native-like is a combination of 2 things. It's exposure, but it's most of all also interaction with other human beings. If we do the math and we consider native speakers, let's consider a 18-year-old native speaker. 18 years times 365 days times 24 hours, because I believe that the brain, we learn even when we sleep, we elaborate the information, it's part of the process. It's, if I did the math correctly, I'm not sure, but it should be correct. It's it's more or less 80,000 hours of living the language as a whole. And living the language as a whole means, when I talk about a holistic process, means that you tend to address all the single aspects of language learning, not speaking, listening, interacting, feelings, and everything else. This is a native speaker or native-like speaker. So first of all, there's a difference between C2 like the C2 that we acquired through our path as learners of a foreign language, and native speakers. The second thing that I wanted to touch upon is the so-called, what I call the paradox of the four knights. Now, most native speakers, not all of them, most native speakers can read, write, listen, and speak. And we tend to think that one ability leads to the other, right? When somebody asks you, do you speak this, the first question that they ask you is, do you speak English? Do you speak French? They don't ask you, do you understand French? Do you understand English? They ask you, do you speak English? And they take for granted that if you speak a language, you also understand it, you also read it, etc., etc. But this is not necessarily true. So this might be true for most native speakers, but not necessarily for people who are learning another language. I'm Italian, so I'll show you my country. At the beginning of the 20th century, we had a rate of illiteracy. You know what illiteracy means, obviously. Illiteracy is the total inability to read and write. You cannot either read, write anything. Nevertheless, illiterates can speak and understand speech, and they're still native speakers. 100 years ago, like three out of four people could not read or could not write, but they could speak. And now it's 11%, especially in southern Italy. But this condition, we tend to forget this because in Western countries now the level of illiteracy is very low, but this is a very common situation in other parts of the world. People can they can perfectly communicate, they can talk to people, they can understand people, but they cannot read and they cannot write. This tells us something, that maybe these abilities are not strictly interconnected. If you think about it, what we did, almost all of us, I hope, is that we have an obliged path to fluency when we're native speakers, because the first thing that we do is to listen. Then we speak or try to babble words, try to say something, and then we read, we learn to read, and finally we learn to write at school. But as a learner of a foreign language, you don't have an obliged path because you're free to choose the order in which you want to learn. And that ordering impacts skill development. If you decide just to listen to the language, let's suppose that you don't want to see anything of Chinese characters, you hate them, you don't want to see them. So you just try to decide to learn the spoken language. What is going to happen is that you're going to develop the capacity of understanding connected speech in Chinese, but you're not going to be able to read Chinese characters. So you just developed one thing instead of another. Has it ever happened to you that maybe you can understand the language, you can read it, but when it comes to speaking, you can barely string things together? You know, it's an active ability, different from passive. So we tend to develop, we have the choice. We can choose. As native speakers, we don't choose. We just follow. We all learn more or less languages the same way as native speakers, but not as when we try to learn a foreign language. So the choices that we make impact the way we learn in our skills. I call it the four knights here, meaning the four main language skills. They may appear entangled in native speakers. We might take for granted that if you speak, you can do all the rest, but they're fundamentally different and they're separated. The way these skills develop depends on your learning path. I'm still referring to, you know, if you want to learn a foreign language. The risk here, and it's a very important point, is that if you focus too much on developing one skill, it goes to the detriment of other skills. If you develop, for example, you get great at writing, but then you might not get as great at speaking or at understanding things. There are people, you know, who can speak a language well, but they have problems understanding it. It might sound strange, but it's true. They can read complicated text, but when it comes to interacting with other people, they have a lot of difficulties. So I see the target language or the language you want to learn as a castle, and I see the four knights here because it's a point of attack, it's a plan of attack. You're attacking a castle, but if you attack it this way, one after the other, you can see here listening, reading, etc., in a line, it's not going to be as efficient as if you attack it from multiple sides, as I'll show you in a second. Can you hear me? Or now, I'd like to show you some strategies my personal strategies on how to get to this level. So the first strategy is when you have reached an intermediate level, you can continue developing the 4 skills as you advance. Now, it's obvious that some skills they're going to advance they're going to be a little bit slower. It's not reading. If you read, for example, a European language, which has a script which is similar to yours, it's easier to read than starting to speak. You struggle when you speak, It's difficult because you have to coordinate a lot of things in your head. You have to see the other person. Speaking is extremely complex. You have to think about the ideas. You have to process in your head. You have to look at all the faces who are looking at me. And even when you're doing a one-to-one lesson, for example, on Skype, and in real life, you have sounds, you have interference. It's very complicated. While reading is just something you do, just you and the book, or you and whatever you're using. So some things get obviously advance slower, but the point here is to make them advance, all of them at the same time, a little bit every day, because you're attacking the castle from different directions. And why would you do this? The 4 skills reinforce each other mutually. It's like, that's the reason why I used the band of 4 knights. They're cooperating together. Because you will notice that writing reinforces reading, reading reinforces writing, listening reinforces speaking, speaking reinforces listening, and so on. Imagine that you're like watching a movie and all of a sudden you found a word, you just wrote it down, and then the day after you talk to somebody and that person said something, you say, oh, I heard that in that movie, or you're trying to use that word in another context. If you do it in a certain way, they're going to reinforce each other, and they do it in a very efficient way. Now, the second strategy is this. This might be a little bit controversial, but this is how I see the concept of fluency. Now, fluency is a word, people quibble about the word fluence, I think this is fluent, I think that is fluent. Everybody's got a different definition of that. I have this definition, this vision. I don't know if you can see, there's a difference here. This is a different color. This is the core. I call it the core. I don't know if you can tell, but from here. I call the core basic fluency. In every language, according to the statistics, the number of words that we actually use in daily conversations, in daily life, is a tiny portion of all the words that exist in the vocabulary. So when I talk about basic fluency, and even personal fluency, here we're using the most basic words that almost everybody uses. For example, think about words like and, or, the, at, sleep, eat. These are words that are commonly used almost by anybody in every conversation, because we're talking about what did you do today? I just woke up at 7, I went to work. Go is the verb, to go, to work, things that have to do with your personal life and everybody's life. But then you have another level. This is where things get a little bit fuzzy, which is called personal fluency. Now think about it. There are a number of words that everybody uses, but there are also other words that some person might use and some other might not. If you have a specific job, you will use certain words that refer to your job, while another person will not know them. Think about, screwdriver, for example. You use somebody, you say, you don't know the word screwdriver? Some people know it because they might use it every day. Some other people might not know them because they don't need it. The personal fluency means the words that you need, depending on your experiences, on your work, country, friends. I heard somebody said that you're not fluent or proficient if you don't know how to tie your shoelaces, But some people never learn how to use the words for shoelaces because they just do it. They don't need. There are some things that you don't need even to know when you do them. So the concept of fluency is something very personal, and the way you learn a language when it comes to this level impacts enormously on the efficiency at which you acquire language. If you focus on the things that are not useful to you, if you learn words that you're never going to use, you're telling your brain, this information is important, but your brain is going to reject it. Well, if you start learning based on things that you like, and based on things that you have to say, because the very first thing that, if you work, one of the very first things that people are going to ask you is, what do you do? So you might better be prepared to know, to talk about work and using the specific words that have to do with your work. And then you have another level, which is the level of I call the level of literacy. It's fluency and broad vocabulary associated with high levels of education. You will notice here that if you have basic fluency and personal fluency, you can still talk very fluently with people, but this doesn't necessarily imply that you can read a book and understand everything. For example, in my case, Russian, I can talk about pretty much not everything, but a lot of things right now. I consider myself fluent. I have no problem communicating with other human beings, but when it comes to reading a book, I'm not talking about Tolstoy, I'm talking about a book about World War II, I'm passionate about that, I'm trying to read, for example, something about that. It's very difficult to read it because there's thousands and thousands of words that we don't use in our daily life. What I want to say is that basic fluency and personal fluency, you can build a core without necessarily knowing thousands and thousands and thousands of words. This is another level. It's just called level of literacy. So if you want to develop a strategy to learn how to converse with people, it doesn't require that much time, and it doesn't require that many words. But you have to know how to establish your routine to develop basic and then personal fluency. The combinatorial logic of the core. What I wanted to stress is the fact that if with n words, you can form an enormous amount of sentences thanks to the so-called syntax. You can put things together, but you don't need to know 1 million words or like 80,000 words. If you think about it, with like 3,000 or 4,000 words, you can form an enormous amount of sentences and an infinite. A sentence can contain an infinite number of words. I think that John is cute. I think that she thinks that John is cute, and so on. So it's called recursive. It's a recursion. You can use with just 3,000 to 4,000 words. That's the reason why people get surprised and they say, I know just 4,000 words? How is it possible? It's possible because with 4,000 words, if you know how to use them, you can say pretty much anything. And the goal is to train. The goal is not to, somebody might not agree with me, but the goal at the beginning is not to know as many words as possible and put them there in the locker. It's how to train to form sentences, which is much more powerful, because once you've built the net, then the elements are like mosquitoes or flies that get caught in the spider web. When you have a solid spider web, all the elements get caught in the net. And in this sense, language is like Lego. You have all these pieces, and you have to learn immediately how to put them together. To form like a helicopter and a car and even Mona Lisa, for the most artistic ones. Another thing is another strategy, and I think this is the most important part of the presentation probably. There are two main things. People say, and I myself used to say that as well. People say, I don't have the time to learn a foreign language. But if you change your mindset and tell yourself, it's not that I don't have the time, I don't make the time. It changes completely. When you haven't done something, you say, I didn't make the time. Some people might come up with the excuse and say, well, I didn't have the time today. It's not true. You always have at least 10 minutes, 20, even 10 minutes, even 5 minutes can make a difference. And if you decide to make the time, and I'm talking about daily passive exposure, like radio, podcasts, documentaries, movies, you have the so-called bucket effect, like a little bit every day. Who doesn't have the time to, when you go to work, I don't know, you're at home, you can listen to podcasts, radios, you can watch documentaries when you come back. You always can find and can make the time to do something if you want to. This is the very first thing, and you have to do it on a daily basis because of the bucket effect. If you do it on the daily basis, it's going to be effective. It doesn't imply that you have to do it every single day. If you skip a day, it's going to be the end of the world. You can't skip a day. But it's better to do it on a daily basis, more or less, because it's very powerful for the brain. We're literally feeding the brain. And this is probably the most important thing. And this is the thing that probably changed my life. It creates the chances. When you reach to a certain level, we hit a plateau, meaning that for some reason we cannot move on. We say, well, we're still trying to learn, we're still trying to accumulate words, we're still trying to talk to somebody, but for some reason we don't advance. And this is what makes the difference. This is in the case of, I'm relating to myself in the case of Russian, it made a huge difference because I created the chances. I saw, a big wall, because Russian, for those who speak Russian or learn Russian, it's an extremely complex language. So it's very difficult. And the more you delve into it, the more difficult it gets. I don't want to sound discouraging, but that's how it is. So what happened to me is that I was delving into Russian. I was just figuring out how difficult it was, and I wanted to find another reason to learn to practice it on a daily basis, to make it part of my life. And I created the chance. And this changed quite a lot my level of Russian, because I started using it on a daily basis. But it's not just this. I started using Russian for other things. For example, for lessons, giving lessons in Russian, or teaching other languages from Russian. So you have to explain everything, the grammar, etc. It gets difficult, but it helps. You struggle, but you do it a little bit, and you don't think about it anymore. You're not studying deliberately a language anymore. You're just using it, and you're learning it as a consequence. It's much more powerful. And obviously, when I talk about creating the chances, it's not that each and every one of you has to find a girl and to live with them, You get a message and say, hey, I'm going to live together. No, it doesn't have to be like that. But even if it's not a daily contact, you can still go out and, for example, go out for a couple hours for a drink, or like 3 hours, whatever. Things that accumulate, and they make a difference. So this is like one part, living together. But it's also in Italy, now that I'm back in Rome, I go out with the number of Italians I go out with, apart from my dear friends, is like I live with foreigners. Like, my life is completely with foreign languages, even if I'm in Italy. I don't think that I speak that much, maybe 20 minutes a day, and I'm in Rome, So it's the way you live that makes a huge difference. It's not just make the time. We always, and all of us, can listen to the radio, podcasts, documentaries. Right now, each and every one of us knows how to get the material, what to do with podcasts, what to do with radios. We can read and listen as much as we can. But what about daily interaction? This is what really makes a difference, is how when you decide to make a difference in your life. You say, well, I want to do this. But if you want to make it happen, if you want to reach native-like fluency, you cannot just learn with books, radio, podcasts, etc. Because when you learn a language for real, it becomes a part of you. You have to integrate feelings, states of mind in your language learning process. So I consider building fluency a little bit like a sandcastle. You have a combination of two things. You have passive exposure, and I call it substance. That's what we do with the radio. We read newspapers, magazines, podcasts, etc. And water is the interaction, meaning interaction with native speakers, feelings, friendship, going out, experiences, living something together. And the right combination of these two factors can create a very solid castle. If you put too much water and little sand, or too much sand and little water, it's not going to work the way it should work. And if you reach this native-like level, you have built a solid castle. And a combination of these two things is key. You have to have passive exposure. For example, you wake up during a day, you listen to 30 minutes of a podcast or to the radio, but then you also go out for a couple hours and you use the language that you want to learn. Possibly on a daily basis, but this is all about making the chances alive. You first have to, it's like when you're learning a language and you want to have something to read and listen, first you get the material, then you organize it. That's the same thing as making the chances. You have to make the chance and organize your life in a certain way so that you can have daily practice, daily natural practice, not even thinking that you're using the language, just use it. Don't think about it. So, this is like, if you consider natural interaction, meaning native speakers, feelings, going out, experiences, etc., and you're thinking about deliberate exposure, that is the exposure that you deliberately choose to have, like by listening to a podcast, the radio, etc., you, starting from this point, which is point 0, that's the origin of the system, you can move towards different directions. So you can see here the layers. You can have beginner, you always start from the beginner, then you move on to intermediate and advanced, but you can move in different ways. We have different examples of this. We have people who tend to speak a lot with native speakers but not read that much, but they still reach a certain advanced level of fluency, and this is what a lot of native speakers do. Even a lot of Italians or a lot of Americans, a lot of people, they have natural interaction. They listen to the radio, they talk, but they're not literate. When you ask an Italian, you say, like according to the level of C2. Give me a presentation, understand the finer shades of meaning, and then reconstruct the whole thing. How many people can actually do that? Not that many, you know? You know? So this is like the way you move. You can decide to have a lot of natural interaction. You can decide to have deliberate exposure, or you can decide to have both at the same time. There are people on the other side who tend to spend an awful amount of time on books and just on books because, you know, they don't find conversations without native speakers interesting. So they stick to, I heard that somebody said that he doesn't want to talk to people because 99% of the people have nothing interesting to say. I don't agree, but that's his idea, you know, if he wants to go for that. So, oops. So, I don't know if you can see, well, you can see it here, but not here because you have the contrast. You have this kind of cloud. Can you see it from here? No. Okay, let me see if I can do the magic trick. No, magic trick doesn't work. Okay, well, there's, this is a cloud. It's just a cloud that you don't see. It's a little bit fuzzy. And you have native-like. So you have native-like there. I wanted to compare, now even here on the slide, I don't know if you can see, this is supposed to be German, but it's, well, you have, it's supposed to be German and have French here. So if I compare the two languages, this is where I would put them. The difference between my French and my German is that even if they're both at advanced level, I would even call it C2 because I passed the exam. But it doesn't mean it, you know, to pass the exam doesn't necessarily mean that you have that level. But I would say that the difference is that I lived France. I lived France, the French. You know, you understand things that I would never have understood if I hadn't lived in the country. Once I was trying to, I don't know if in your country, but cutting the salad, for example, for me it's something normal. You have like these big leaves and you want to cut the salad. But in France, at least in the family I was with, you say, qu'est-ce que tu fais? Tu coupes la salade. It was like a shame, you know, or you want to cut the salad. I was like, I'm sorry, I just wanted to cut the salad. But yeah, or like you go to Italy and you cut the spaghetti. You say, oh my God, you're not supposed to cut spaghetti. But it's also about, for example, we have we have some prejudices towards people. This helped me understand also how the French think. The French have, you know. Well, not how they express some feelings. For example, the French have this way of using their lips, which we, as Italians, we find it very deranging. But it's like, for example, you say, how did it go, like at that party? And as an Italian, I would say, è stato carino. And I use certain, you know, facial features. But a French would do like, bon, c'était pas mal, mais finalement. So when you, a lot of people, some Parisians do that. You know, you have a conversation, bon, oui, bon, bon. And then they use this thing, you know, and you can find it a little bit deranging at first, but then you understand that it's part of the code, you know? Or like when you walk inside like a restaurant and you say, and that person goes, bonjour, bonjour, and you say, is he angry, you know? And the reason why he's angry is that in France, when you walk in a shop, the very first thing is bonjour. You have to say that. It's part of the thing. Or like when you stop somebody on the street, you say, excusez-moi, madame, bonjour, and she goes like, bonjour. So first you have to, it's part of the thing, you know. And I have these things integrated, like the way they move their eyes, their lips, it's part of the language. You know, we tend to think that language is just words and sentences, what comes out of our mouth, but the reality is that it's a whole, it's a whole thing. It's a holistic process that encompasses like facial features, the way we think, the way we express our things. And I have this in France because I lived there for 3 years. And I lived in a family microenvironment as well as a macro environment, having to deal with people, shops, etc., etc. I don't have that in German. I have a lot of friends, made a lot of friends. I had a lot of conversations with native speakers, but not on a consistent daily basis. It's not the same thing that happened with French. But what I did, and the difference between these two, is that probably I know the language. Knowing the language doesn't mean that you can speak it better, but you know it better because I read tons of magazines like Der Spiegel, for example, tons of magazines, a lot of books, listened to the radio. When I was at the conference, this conference interpreting school, the teacher told us, you know, living in the country, if you want to be an interpreter, you can live in the country for 20 years, but if you don't delve into the real language, like radio, France Culture, and these things, you can always listen to the daily conversations, but your level is not going up. In order to work as an interpreter, you need a very high level, and we're talking about education, understanding the mentality, etc., etc. So what happened is that you can see here on this framework that I have so-called C2, I passed both exams. I didn't have a problem with that, but there's a difference. There's a subtle difference between the way I lived French and the way I lived Germany. And the native-like is still here. I have a glimpse of what it means to be native, but still I'm not a native. If I talk for a long time with French can tell that I'm not a native speaker. Native English speakers can tell that I'm not a native speaker. It doesn't matter. The point is, and the last thing that I wanted to emphasize, is the fact that it might sound a little bit trite or maybe a little bit cheesy, but anybody can do that. What made the difference when people tell me, for example, Luca, you speak 10 languages, it's incredible. How did you do that? It's no magic trick. It's just I made some very important decisions, and I just figured out in the last 4 to 5 years how to live in a certain way and how to make languages an integral part of my life. This is not about your intellectual ability. It's the way you live that makes a huge difference. And once again, I don't want to sound trite and cheesy, but each and every one, I've seen it happen with so many people who can speak 4, 5, 6 languages extremely well, and then ask them all, what is it that you do? And they, what they do is that they use it on a daily basis. They stop using books. Now, there's a language nerd in me as well, but the thing is that I like books, but I just use very, very few books, and then I take off with life, And taking off with life is all about making decisions. What kind of decisions do you want to make is what makes a difference. Thank you. Can I have oh no, this is for me, right? You have a glass of water? No, I was thinking about a glass of water. Oh, obviously if you have any questions, feel free to ask.
No, I have a shout. I'm half serious and half joking, but I found out by accident that you can give a real boost to your, oh, thank you. I'm not going to shout it. So you can give a real boost to your language learning between advanced and native level, or even between intermediate and advanced level, if you meet the police. Think about the logic of the situation. When a policeman wants to talk to you in the language that you're learning and you live in that country, you have to pay attention to what he's saying very carefully, because if you make a mistake, then you end up in jail. You have to be also very careful what you say and how you say it, so you have to impress the policeman of the target country that you speak their language better than you actually do. And if ever, it never happened to me, but if you ever have to write something, then you have to read very carefully what they write to you, and you have to write back very carefully. So, in fact, it's just a really joke, because But I thought, now that I was listening to Luca, I was thinking, what kind of situations are there when you are forced? You are not out of your comfort zone. You are not sitting at home and comfortable, but when you really have to make sure that every word you pronounce correctly and you don't say the wrong word the wrong time. I think this is funny. If it ever happens to you, and what I mean is that don't deliberately break the law. I'm not trying to say that. But if it happens to you, you cross the red light, something, and policeman wants to talk to you, make it an occasion. Don't let it go. Try to talk to the policeman as long as possible. What do you think, Luca? Have you ever?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, that's an extreme situation, with the policeman. But if you find yourself
Polish girl too. In Germany, you are nice.
Polish girls, what? Oh, I thought you said Polish girls. I say in Germany, what? Yeah, no, that's true. Well, it could be a little bit stressful, though. I think it all depends on personal taste. There are some people who are stressed when it comes to speaking. So if you go to a conversation and you think you're going to end in jail, that's going to be even more stressful, So no, I think it should be a combination of things. It shouldn't be just the police and the fear of getting arrested, but also you can find yourself in situations which are a little bit challenging. But I would say, take this one step at a time. One of the very first things that I would do personally, and what I do, is find yourself establish a connection with somebody who is nice, and then you can start talking to them on Skype, for example, or like face to face. But that person has to resonate with you. It's very important that that person be nice. It's good. This point of finding challenging is good, but it can be counterproductive, because if something gets too complicated or stressful, it could backfire. So on and off, yeah, challenge like the policeman or the fireman or whatever. But you too. What? Who's next? You?
I'd just like to make a comment. It's just a comment. There is a softer way to feel the pressure, just to move for a few days, if possible, to some place that speaks that language. Yeah, so I've been studying German for 3 years, almost 4 years, but I felt the pressure when I arrived here, because everything I tried to do in German. The only case I gave up very quickly was when I lost my luggage, and I wanted to speak in English because I want to be sure that I receive my luggage again. But in the rest of situations, I've eaten, I've bought things, everything in German. So I pressure myself, and when I don't understand, I ask again, and I ask again until I pretend I understood. But there's a kind of pressure being in a country that doesn't speak your language, yeah, and it's softer than the police itself, yeah. So just this.
It's not just about the fear of speaking, I think. It's also about the fear of not understanding. This is one of the biggest fears of everybody. Imagine you're having a conversation, you have these sentences that you've prepared very well, and all of a sudden he gets back to you and says something that, hey, what do you think about that? And you're like, I didn't understand a word. That also can be a problem. So you have to make sure that you want to understand. But sometimes understanding connected speech, unfortunately, is something that requires training. You have to listen to start understanding and make out the single parts of the language. But at the same time, when people ask you a direct questions, there are always key factors, always key words that you can get, and plus the context. Somebody is talking about, say, Germany, and then they use the word where, how, or we're talking about the language, German, you already know that we're talking about learning German. Somebody asks you how, even if you don't understand the rest, you will understand that they're going to ask you, how did you learn German? You can infer it. It's also about a matter of anticipating, and that releases a lot of pressure. You have to understand, this is one of the things that I train my students with. The very first thing is to understand, to figure out the key words in a specific context, because the key words are those things that even if you don't understand, nobody wants to embarrass themselves, but in that situation, if you go and try to use this, you have to do it, but sometimes, the problem is that they get back to you and you say, I'm sorry. You don't want to say, I didn't understand anything. Or you might say it once, twice, but then it gets a little bit annoying. If you say, I'm sorry, I don't understand. So he might say, well, why are you trying to do this if you don't understand? But, you can pick up things, and you have to be relaxed when it comes to conversations like that, because people are forgiving, And it's very important from a psychological point of view. When you're stressed out, you don't learn. Your brain just filters like water, like a strainer, and it doesn't retain the information. So you have to make sure, as a psychological preparation, that you go there, and first you have some things that you can use, which are like these keywords, and then you have to, people understand that you're learning their language and you're willing. If you show yourself enthusiastic, people are going to appreciate it anyway. So.
I actually really like this example of the policeman, because there's two other examples that pop into my head that were stressful, actually 3, and 2 of them were at later stages of my German learning, and they were me opening up a PayPal account that could accept currency from my German bank account, and I didn't confirm the email address, so I actually had to call somebody and talk to a human being, and it was such that my bank information was in this system, so I didn't want to just let it sit there and forget about it. So I was like, oh my God, I've got to talk about money, and I have to have the right answers, and this is really important, and this is identifying information, and la la la. Turns out the guy was very, very skilled on the other end, because he talks on the phone all day long, and so that was really helpful. It was a lot less stressful than I might have thought. Another example was when I was studying, or I just moved to Germany. I had to have a refrigerator delivered to me, and the guy calls up at 8 o'clock in the morning. I had just woken up to tell me that I was the one who was next in line to get the delivery. Of course I didn't understand. They said like some thick Byron accent or something like that. And, you know, I was trying to get him to repeat, and I had just woken up, so all my strategies of being this great language learner just like out the window. So then I got off the phone feeling kind of stupid, and I'm like, you know what, I can do better than this. So I used my the call history on my phone, and I was like, okay, let me get my dictionary. So I got my dictionary, and I looked up some vocabulary. I'm like, okay, Kühlschrank, great. Let me call back and see if this is the delivery guy, you know? And so I was able to do some, you know, post-conversation work and then pre-reading essentially. And then I called him back, and I'm like, ich bin Ursula, you know, ich wohne in Friedrichshain, la 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 la, you know. And I was able to chat with him, and he was super forgiving because, I mean, I'm calling him back and he doesn't speak English. So that was also a strategy that I found extraordinarily useful.
It motivates you, right? Yeah. So once you get that, you have a feeling of accomplishment. I did it, you know, you can do it again.
And then I saw the guy's face, and he was like, hey.
Happy, you know.
Would you be able to tell? Wow. Would you be able to share with us what a typical day is like for you with languages?
Let's keep the girl part.
So, well, the question is, you asked me about learning or about practicing? Because it two, like...
You said languages is part of your life and you decided to live in a certain way.
Okay, so...
One of your days and how you live it.
Okay, so right now I work as a language coach, meaning that I train people in different languages from different languages. So I tend to use a number of them, and always in combination. For example, Russian, English, English, Russian, Italian, Spanish, Spanish, English, etc. So my work allows me to use 6, 7, 8 languages on a daily basis, but in not just speaking. It's also about some techniques that I've developed. Like, for example, one is called image training. So I'm training others, and I'm training myself, you know, to maintain a number of languages. So, for example, if I have a couple of students in the morning, it's like 2 or 3 hours. Then I have other 2 in the afternoon. So on a typical day, it could be 3 to 4, and in a combination, so it would be 6 to 8 languages. When it comes to learning, now I'm mostly focusing on improving my Polish to avoid inflicting Polish on native speakers when I go to Poland. And but basically it works like this. During the day, I work with a number of languages, and then at night, when I go out, I mostly spend time with native speakers who speak like Russian, English, French, Spanish, and then I live with a Russian girl, so I tend to use Russian all the time, or on a daily basis. So this is how it looks like. But there are other days when I do something different. Now, not every day is like this language consultant things. I'm also working on other projects that you know, force me to use languages at a different level. So basically, hope that's the answer you were looking for.
Thank you very much for the presentation, first of all. It was very enlightening. I have a particular question regarding the way people speak in terms of the oral production, so accent, native-like, phonology that people use. For example, you can use very, very elaborate grammar, very elaborate ways of speaking, lots of obscure vocabulary, but if it still sounds like I am speaking Morse code, then it doesn't really sound natural. How do you approach this kind of thing, and the way you all not just read naturally, write naturally, but also make it sound, intonate as if it's coming from a real French, respectively German, Spanish, or Quechua person?
So the question would be how to reach needlelike pronunciation, right? Do we have a... Can I draw something here? I think we have nothing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Well, the very first thing that I do is to remember that... So... I don't know if it's visible. I just want to write word 1, word 2, word 3, etc., etc. The very first step is that I consider both vocabulary retention and sounds as at the you have mainly I have two approaches here. You have the bottom-up approach and you have the top-down approach. When it comes to forming sentences, for example, the very first thing that comes to your mind is if you want to assemble sentences together, you have to put words together. And the same thing is for sounds. You know, people, I think the biggest mistake is that if I want to teach you the pronunciation of a given language, you first start with words, and you have the teacher going like, how do you pronounce this? How do you pronounce this? And they give you simple words. So you say word, you say Paris, etc., etc. But the problem is that a language is not just a sum of words. A language is a combination of them, both in terms of grammar and above all on sounds. I'll give you an example. I'm not sure you can read this. My writing is absolutely terrible. I want to call my mom, okay? This is the sentence. Now, if you're learning English, for example, you would have I want to call my mom. So if you just learn the pronunciation of the single words, it doesn't mean that you can pronounce this as it should be, like I want to call my mom. So you can see here that this is called a phonetic network. We tend to what I do, this is my top-down approach, is that I start with sentences and then I go down and refine the pronunciation of the single words. If you start with the single words, you might get stuck because depending on where the word is, I'm not just referring to English. English is a special case, but in other languages, if mom is at the beginning of the sentence is one thing. If mom is at the end of the sentence is another. And if it's at the center, it's a different one. I want to call my mom, and you go down with your pitch. My mom is a great woman, and you go up with the pitch. So depending on the function and the position, you have, this is called suprasegmental features. You have something that changes, even if you have the same pronunciation of the word. What I want to stress, this sounds a little bit complicated, but in very simple terms, I listen and read. I make sure that I create a bond between the script and the sounds, and then I go for meaning and sounds. When somebody says, for example, I want to go to Italy, you have to learn to train yourself how to see the patterns. When you give a statement, whatever you say, I like Italian. You go down at the end. You can see this. When you ask a question, you normally go up. For example, do you want to go to the cinema? Or if you have something like I like Italy, but, and you have a contrast between two sentences, you tend to raise your pitch because you're creating a contrast. And there's a number of patterns that you can learn in a number of European languages, and you can simply learn it by doing a certain training. So I start with that, which is called suprasegmental features. They're called suprasegmental because they're so above the segments that are the words. If you tackle languages like this, then everything gets easier later. Think about one glaring example of this is that people tend to learn Chinese by learning the single tones. So they say, well, if I pronounce the single tones correctly, then I'm going to pronounce a sentence very well. But if you think about it, even if Italian is not a tonal language, but it has tones, it has different heights on syllables. Even if it might sound strange, when you say something like voglio andare a Roma, which means I want to go to Rome, you say voglio andare a Roma. They're all different, these syllables are all different heights. Okay? But imagine learning Italian by learning the single syllables and how they're supposed to be pronounced. It would be a nightmare. You have to learn directly how to say the word, and then Italians don't even think about tones. They just say a word. So as kids, they just learn the sounds, the fragments of the language going towards their ears, and they internalize it, and then they infer the meaning of the single words because they develop this mental lexicon. They see the words. So I could tell you that one thing that everybody should avoid is to learn the pronunciation of single words. Just go directly and tackle sentences. Listen to sentences that are embedded in texts, not just single words. If you have a list of 100 words, and they give you, and this is the way a lot of software programs work, actually. You say, mom, dad. Who talks like that? Even, I think Rosetta Stone, he show you the horse, and horse. So who goes like, if you don't want to learn a language, say horse, communicating with that, and it sounds ridiculous. So now it's a little bit more complex, because obviously this is like very brief vision, but every language is different. Every language has a different phonetic structure. So English is one thing, French is another, etc. You have syllable, etc., etc. But the message here is that one should focus on the upper elements and then go down to the elements like words. Words are the bricks of a language, but they're always embedded in a code. And remember, if you crack the code, then the words are going to come. They're going to stick to the spider web.
The only thing I would add to that, is that it's very useful to work on a word if it breaks the rhythm, if it prevents you from doing that sentence, that complete phrase. If you get stuck somewhere, that's where I think the word work could be useful. Just like, how do I relate this sound to this spelling? But other than that, yeah.
There are words that are fans of IPA, for example. They say, the IPA is a system to define these things, but yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Is there anyone for the Esperanto challenge, 6-week challenge? Me!
Is there anybody for the Esperanto challenge, I think? So, I don't know if all of you know the IPA, right? So do you find it very useful? Do you think that without the IPA you would have learned to pronounce a language? I mean, do you think it's useful, or? Okay, give me 3 reasons why it's useful. Anybody? I know you. Okay, last question. He says we have to finish. I'll give you that. Every time you speak a lot more than
No. Well, I just have it. Yesterday I gave a talk about it, and for me, what I didn't point out yesterday is this is not only theory. This was very, very important to me to learn phonetics in new languages, and it is still. I mean, if I have to learn a new language, it is very quick to me now to grasp the new sounds, to understand which.
I think that has to do with the fact that it's not the IPA, but it's the fact that you have listened to the sounds and you have made them yours. So you think, like, scripts were created much later. Like, languages are basically phonetic things. That's the reason why we get confused when you have another script. Then the combination and the representation of that system in another language can get you confused. But maybe the reason why is that when you know a lot of sounds, you have a sound inventory which is bigger, then you tend to grasp the sounds and say, oh, this is different. For example, I didn't understand that, the difference between like tiny things. But when you get a language in the language system, then you can actually learn easier. But it's always sounds, It's the IPA might be useful for a lot of people. I don't dispute that. But for example, I've never used it my whole life.
It's not necessary, but it helps.
It can help. It can help, but it could also get in the way, depending on how you tackle things, I guess. 'Cause I saw some things that are very interesting. Canip also, like, there's not just the IPA. Yeah, it's very interesting from a scientific point of view, but this is the same thing as linguists and polyglots. People say you have to understand linguistics in order to speak a language. Not true. It's like being like a pilot. If you want to make an airplane work, you don't need to read the manual, and see the mechanics of stuff. You have to make it work. This is just the point I wanted to emphasize. But you have to find a way to tackle things such as this, because pronunciation and intonation is one of the things that interest the most. A lot of people want to speak like a native speaker. They want to. It's like, but I believe that it doesn't have to be the number one goal, but I do believe that in my case it changed my life. All the time when I made a lot of interesting and deep connections with people, it was because of I was just talking to people, and all of a sudden they say, oh, why do you speak like this? Have you ever been to America? No, I've never been to America. Oh, really? Oh, it's incredible. And you start talking to people, and they ask about your life, and it's, I think that sounds, and not so much as pronunciation. When I was to the interpreting school, my teacher told me, for an interpreter, the most important thing is not pronunciation. You can mess some things up, but intonation is very important, because intonation conveys meaning. In all the things that we say, in every moment of our life, we use intonation to convey our feelings, thoughts, and connect with people. And I think that's integral part of communicating with other people. I think that's...